About 2 months ago, during the State of Unreal presentation 2026, Epic Games executed what might be one of the biggest rug pulls in game development history, by announcing that Blueprint visual scripting will be deprecated with some version of Unreal Engine 6 and that it will be succeeded by the Verse programming language. On top of that, the entire actor system will also be going away in favor of Scene Graph, which is an entity component system already available as a beta feature in UEFN. The fact that the other half of the presentation was pretty much just them showing off AI integration or UEFN news that most of us don't care about didn't really help either. Even though blueprints are the main reason for many people to use Unreal Engine over other engines, the announcement that they'll eventually be deprecated was handled very poorly, and it was only mentioned as a little side note. Although they've been talking about Verse being a main feature of UE6 for quite a while now, I still think this took most of us by surprise because they mentioned multiple times how Verse was supposed to work together with C++ and Blueprints and not be a direct replacement for Blueprints. For example, at GDC 2023,
and this isn't to replace Blueprints, this is to augment Blueprints. So if you love programming with Blueprints, keep doing it.
and again at GDC 2024.
That'll mean that you can have a mix of Blueprints versus C++, and it can all call into each other.
But that doesn't appear to be the plan any longer, and they slowly want to phase out blueprints. I find it especially ironic that at the same State of Unreal where they announced blueprint deprecation, they also highly praised Expedition 33, which uses blueprints for 95% of its implementation, and would have never come to fruition if it wasn't for blueprint visual scripting. Even though I have a very strong opinion about all of these topics, you might have noticed that I've been weirdly quiet and seemingly ignoring the whole thing. Well, the main reason is that I was probably more angry and disappointed than anyone else, so it took me this long to find my footing again, and if I made a video any earlier, it would have just been a long rant full of profanity driven by anger and fear. So after I finally calmed down, I asked you guys what you think of the situation. I watched hours worth of Verse presentations, and I spent a few days trying out UEFN, the Verse programming language, and Scene Graph. But I'm still very worried about the direction Unreal Engine 6 is taking. So let's get into why that is. The biggest thing that has everybody up in arms is the fact that blueprints will be deprecated once Scene Graph and Verse are sufficiently matured. So that means the early access version of Unreal Engine 6, set to release near the end of 2027, and the full release version of UE6, which will probably come out sometime in 2029, will still have blueprint and actor support. But they will be deprecated in favor of Verse and Scene Graph eventually, maybe with Unreal Engine 6.2, maybe 6.3, who knows. And this is a very questionable move, especially considering that blueprints are basically lightning in a bottle and beloved by countless Unreal developers. Even though Epic mainly marketed them as a tool for prototyping games, the community showed them that they can be used for so much more, and entire games can effectively be made with blueprints even by people that have no programming background. Many other game engines also tried to implement visual scripting solutions, but they were just never as mature as blueprints and failed to catch on to the same level. So it's really strange they're being scheduled for deprecation even though they've proven themselves in so many ways. Now of course blueprints aren't perfect and they do have some long-standing issues, but I believe for a lot of developers the trade-off was worth it. And just to make things clear, deprecation doesn't mean removal. It just means you're discouraged from using them and they won't be supported any longer, but might still work. So basically we still have a lot of time left until then, and we can also choose to just stay on Unreal Engine 5.8, which I will probably do for my personal projects. But Unreal Engine also being my job, I have to stay up to date with Verse and all other changes. I started off wanting to hate Verse because it is the language that will be responsible for the death of my beloved blueprints, and on top of that, my two biggest issues with Verse were always that, first, it is a language specifically designed to solve the metaverse problem, which is something the vast majority of developers using Unreal do not care about at all. And second, that Verse is defined as a multi-paradigm functional logic language. And to me, functional programming has always been that weird thing off in the distance that I'm glad I would probably never have to learn, because it seemed very confusing and it didn't seem very practical to me, especially for making games. In a presentation from 2023, Simon Peyton-Jones, who is the co-creator of Haskell and one of the many co-creators of Verse, even said that all of this is highly experimental.
Then the grand experiment is, actually, when we get to the enterprise of writing large programs, is this a better way to write programs? And that is the grand experiment in which we are engaged, right? And it is a grand experiment. And just like, is functional programming a better way to write programs? I think so, but the proof that it is, we've been on a 40-year crusade. So our aim here is to take this slightly weird thing and kick it out of the lab and into the mainstream and see how it works.
I'm all for innovation and pushing things forward, but with blueprints eventually being deprecated in favor of verse, this is a grand experiment that could affect the livelihoods of tens of thousands of developers and will punish people who have heavily invested into Unreal Engine because their love of blueprint visual scripting. Of course, we'll still have C++ to fall back on, which is a relief, and since that presentation, verse has been battle tested in UEFN and proved itself to some degree. However, that is just ship verse and not max verse. I've looked at some example code of verse multiple times in the past, and something about the syntax just really rubbed me the wrong way, so I was glad I would never have to use it and just never dug any deeper. But the situation has changed now, and I decided to give verse an honest shot and got my hands dirty by writing some actual verse code so I can tell you guys what it's like. Currently, the easiest way to use verse is through UEFN, and again, while this isn't the complete version of the language we're supposed to get with UE6, it should still give us a pretty good idea in what direction it's going. And on first glance, verse doesn't look that bad here in UEFN. There's some imports, we set up a class, then we override the onBegin function, which is the equivalent to begin play in blueprints, and there already is an official VS Code extension that supports syntax highlighting, arrow squiggles, autocomplete, and much more, already putting this miles ahead of what it's like to work with C++ and Unreal through Visual Studio. And I was also very relieved to find out that we're not going to be forced to write pure functions only without any side effects, but we can still keep on using a very object-oriented way of coding as we've been doing so far.
The language doesn't quite force you to write pure code the way that you would in Haskell. It invites you to write very traditional object-oriented imperative code.
While I just wrote some code in UEFN to practice, I came across quite a lot of things that bothered me, and I was going to do a full rant here about them, but the more time passed, the more I got used to verse, and a lot of these turned out to just be pet peeves of mine rather than real big issues. Like classes using snake case, while functions and variable identifiers use uppercase camel case, a comparison using just equals instead of equals equals, the Boolean data type being called logic, verse using arrow brackets instead of a bang equals to check for inequality, if statements and for loops being abused by almost unreadable functional programming magic, this weird way of writing for loops where the do block just looks completely disjointed, and there being 7 or more different ways to write a for loop in the first place, everybody having a different opinion on if there should be a space around the type definition or not, and so on. And while all of these things at first made my skin crawl because it's just so different from all other programming languages I've been using so far, I don't find it as offensive anymore and guess I can live with it and get used to it. Now, when it comes to the positives, there are a lot of cool things planned for Verse that even I find interesting as somebody who has zero interest in making anything metaverse related. The way that concurrency is built right into the language is very interesting and gives you precise control over what happens when. The way it handles success and failure and how failed transactions are being rolled back is quite interesting. Having easy access to two-dimensional arrays is pretty cool. Having optional named parameters is nice. Easy code sharing through public modules. And most importantly, replication supposedly just working right out of the box would make it a lot easier to create online games if everything will work as advertised. And generally, I just love learning new programming languages and trying out new things, so I actually did have a lot of fun over these couple of days diving into Verse. So all in all, I would say I don't hate Verse, but I also don't love it. More importantly though, the question now is, does Verse really accomplish its goal of being simple enough for first-time programmers to learn?
We need something that's really easy to use, because a lot of the people who are going to be programming for this new medium are going to be learning programming for the first time.
Well, I don't really think so. I believe it's a lot more accessible than C++, not so much because of the syntax, but rather because the development environment is a lot easier to set up, compilation is much faster, Verse protects us from common dangers, such as accessing an out-of-bounds index on an array, and there are no header files forcing us to restart Unreal Engine every time we make a change. But I think because of the sometimes strange syntax and it being a functional logic programming language, it's a lot less accessible than something like Godot's GDScript or C# in Unity. And especially compared to Blueprint visual scripting, I would say it is a lot harder. And I don't see any artists or game designers being willing to take the step to learn Verse the same way they were willing to learn Blueprints. A lot of the node graphs we have available in Unreal do look quite similar to Blueprints, so if an artist has experience with material nodes or control rig, Blueprints won't look as intimidating, even if the actual logic is quite different. And just on a side note, since some people got this wrong, Blueprint visual scripting will be deprecated, but nobody said anything about the material graph, control rig, PCG, or any other graph-based interfaces going away, so nothing should change regarding these, at least that's not what the announcement meant. Blueprints were also a natural stepping stone towards learning C++ and object oriented programming in general, because they were based on similar principles as C++, but Verse almost feels like the anti C++, and I imagine it would be a nightmare to go back and forth between those two languages multiple times a day when working on a big project. So while I personally don't hate Verse in its current form as much as I thought I would, I am very worried about all of the new functional logic features that will come with MaxVerse and what the best practice way to write code will look like. And of course, more than anything, I worry about new people wanting to learn Unreal Engine 6 or people trying to transition from Blueprints to Verse that don't have a programming background. Verse is definitely not that easy to learn, and many people are just very intimidated by code in general and prefer a visual scripting solution. There were some talks about possibly creating a new visual scripting system on top of Verse, which the community dubbed Visual Verse, but shortly after the State of Unreal presentation, Andrew Grant, who is the vice president of engineering, clarified that they prototyped multiple approaches to that, but eventually decided to not have a visual scripting system on top of Verse, and they will instead try to make Verse as accessible as possible. And like I said before, blueprints aren't the only thing that's going to be deprecated, but the whole actor system will also be deprecated in favor of Scene Graph, which brings me to the next topic. Scene Graph is an entity component system which you can already check out in its beta state through the UEFN editor. Instead of everything in our game being an actor, all objects in the world are now made up of entities and components that are placed in a tree structure. And by default, an entity is completely empty and doesn't even have a transform unless we add it ourselves, which is very different from how actors work, since even the most simple actor type we have in Unreal already comes with a long list of properties and behaviors. And this usually isn't a huge issue until we have tens of thousands of objects, as you may have in an open world game. Entity component systems follow the mantra of composition over inheritance, which has been going around for a long time, and switching over to the system is supposed to help sort out the traversal stutter issue Unreal had even back since the UE3 days. We can bundle entities and components together in a prefab, which we can then drag into the world or spawn similarly to how we would using a blueprint. If we make changes to a prefab, these will be applied to all instances of the prefab in the world. But we can also make changes specifically just for one instance. And this is also very similar to what we've been doing with blueprints, but with the one difference that we can actually remove components just for certain instances. Components could be things such as a static mesh, a spotlight, a verse script, a movement component, or so on, and these are actually not all that different from the components we can add to a blueprint actor right now, or the kind of actor components we now create ourselves. Now, on paper, all of this is great, and if implemented correctly, it should lead to performance gains and should also give us easier ways than we have now to query for certain objects in our scene and execute operations on them. But I personally find it quite tedious and was never a fan of the whole ECS and prefab workflow. And it's actually one of the reasons I switched from Unity over to Unreal Engine, since inheritance based actors just made much more sense to me having been raised on object oriented programming. One thing that also really bothered me with Unity is that while I was still using it as my main engine, there was no way to create child prefabs, and it's a feature that only got implemented later. But child prefabs appear to already be a thing in UEFN, so I'm quite happy about that. And now I have to admit that if implemented correctly, Scene Graph is objectively superior to the actor system we currently have, and thinking long term, switching over to it is probably the correct move, even if I'm not super excited about having to retrain my muscle memory with this new workflow. And yeah, by the way, the whole gameplay framework we have with pawns, game modes, the game instance, and so on, all of that will be gone as well and replaced with a new gameplay framework built on Verse and Scene Graph. But all in all, I ended up feeling quite positive about Scene Graph, and as long as we get the sprite and flipper components soon, everything should be fine. Another big step for Unreal Engine 6 will be that the Unreal Engine for Fortnite Editor, or UEFN, will be merged together with Unreal Engine. UEFN was often used as a testbed for new features such as the water system, PCG biomes, the build and animation tools, and many other things, which then made their way into Unreal Engine 5. And currently it has a lot of features like Verse and Scene Graph, which are supposed to ship with the early access release of UE6. After the merger, we will of course still be able to just ship our Unreal games standalone to Steam, itch.io, and other platforms, but in addition to that, we can also release our UE6 games inside of Fortnite to possibly earn money through their revenue share program and in-island transactions. Epic keeps on mentioning how Fortnite or Roblox-like platforms will be the future of gaming and will win out over standalone games, but I very much disagree. And I also wanted to know how you, my viewers, feel about this, so I put out a poll on the channel. And to no surprise to me, less than 10% of you are even remotely interested in releasing your games inside of Fortnite. Now, I do believe it might be very convenient to use Fortnite as a way to just get your feet wet and put out a demo quickly to get some feedback from players, but the problem is that even though releasing a game on there theoretically gives you access to millions of players, you're not really going to be able to evaluate the quality of your game because we live in an attention economy, and what's much more important than making a good game is that you have a premise and thumbnail that works specifically for the Fortnite audience. And when I scroll through Fortnite Creative, pretty much all I see is brain rot slop, AI thumbnails, or just blatant copies of popular Steam games. And this is with the discovery improvements they already rolled out, so I don't even want to know how bad it was before. Even though there certainly are some games that are really creative and interesting, you probably won't be able to find them because the player base and algorithm seems to favor the most brain rotten stuff you can imagine. And even them saying they'll make further improvements to discovery throughout the year doesn't really give me a lot of confidence. To me, this just feels like mobile games all over again. And yeah, there certainly is money in that, but the type of games who do well on those platforms aren't what most of us really aspire to create. Even now, a lot of gamers complain about Unreal and call many games Unreal slop since they believe the engine makes games you create with it too homogenized. And I always pushed against this by pointing out how many great games made with Unreal have unique art styles and how many 2D or 2.5D games there are most people don't even know were made with Unreal. But if we combine the UEFN merge together with the next topic, then I believe in the future the majority of games made with Unreal might actually be slop. While this isn't really a feature of Unreal Engine 6, but rather something we already have access to in UE 5.8, MCP or the Model Context Protocol server was also announced during the State of Unreal presentation. Now, what is MCP? Well, it's basically a system that allows an AI agent like Claude Code or Cursor to connect to Unreal Engine to read information about your project and also access functionality such as spawning actors, creating widgets, adjusting lights, and so on. They showed a demo of it populating a living room with objects, it modifying PCG graphs to create a procedural city, it adjusting materials, it creating UI widgets, it putting together some blueprints to trigger that UI, and a few more things. Then there was another section of it being used to generate images or videos based on a blockout you set up in Unreal. And it appears there will be even more features along those lines with Unreal Engine 6. Even though I think you could make an argument that using AI for some of those things will save you a lot of time and could lead to a faster iteration loop, I also believe it's a very slippery slope where you end up becoming too dependent on these tools and you'll end up using AI for pretty much everything, leading to you not even understanding your own project anymore, immense technical depth, you forgetting how things even work, and a product that just feels soulless and empty. I never directly talked about my stance on generative AI on this channel, but if you've been watching my videos, you could have probably guessed that I'm very much leaning towards the anti-AI side. And I believe you should try to use it as little as possible when making games or actually when doing anything. I think it's probably fine if you use ChatGPT as a glorified Google search every once in a while or to help you proofread something before you send it off, but again, that's how it starts and you have to keep checking yourself. Or before you know it, you'll start to lose trust in yourself and end up needing some AI bot to validate each and every one of your decisions. I've actually gotten hundreds of emails with sponsorship offers for some Gen AI product, and I just could not bring myself to promote any of them. So at this point, I probably turned down around $100,000 while antagonizing every marketing agency out there. So yeah, the channel might be in trouble soon. But I believe the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And if you start avoiding too many of the painful parts of game development or programming in general, you'll never develop perseverance or the very important skill of problem solving. But even if you're already more advanced and past that level, you will forget a lot of the things you spend so much time mastering as you become more and more dependent on these tools. So it creates this downward spiral effect you're gonna have a hard time breaking out of, and soon you'll be completely lost without an agent by your side. There's a quote from the book Atomic Habits, which I think makes a lot of sense in this context. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. So, do you want to be someone who faces challenges head on and is able to build healthy habits and an amazing set of skills that will come in handy not just with game development, but pretty much everything life throws at you? Or do you just want to type some sentences into a word guessing machine and slowly rot away your ability to think for yourself? So, I don't really condemn using agents every once in a while if you really get stuck and tried everything else first, but just keep checking yourself and don't cast too many votes on the wrong version of yourself. I'm very happy that at least for now, the MCP server is just an optional plugin that is deactivated by default, and I very much hope that AI won't be integrated at a deeper level with the editor. So now that we've looked at all of the pain points from the State of Unreal presentation, we can try to draw a conclusion of if we should even bother to switch over to Unreal Engine 6, just stay on UE 5.8, or maybe even switch engines altogether. At least for now, there really isn't all that much to get excited for when it comes to UE6, unless you mainly focus on making online games, in which case Verse just replicating everything out of the box would make things a lot easier. And if you're working on huge open world games and have struggles with performance already, then Scene Graph might also be quite helpful. I think people would have been much more excited about Verse and Scene Graph if these were just additional options and we wouldn't have to sacrifice access to the actor system and blueprints. The announcement just came out of nowhere and felt extremely tone deaf, not considering how people would feel that have invested years of their lives into blueprints and Unreal. And even after all of the backlash, pretty much all we got so far were 2 tweet replies by Andrew Grant, the vice president of engineering at Epic. So we don't really feel heard or taken seriously. It will still be a very long time until Verse and SceneGraph make their way into Unreal Engine, and if Lumen and Nanite are any indication, I don't think everything will just work as advertised right from the 1.0 release. But it might take a few additional years after that for the new framework to actually be production ready. So we still have at least 3 to 5 years left in which blueprints will be the major way of making Unreal games, and even after that we can just use an early version of UE6 which still has blueprints and actors, or just stay on UE 5.8 forever. UE5 or even UE4 has pretty much everything that most indie developers would ever need, so my only worry about staying on old versions is that you won't have access to assets or new plugins that only release for UE6. And if a new console generation releases, those SDKs might only be available for UE6 as well, but all of that is still very far off in the future. I'm also worried about the community splitting apart, with some people staying on UE5 and others moving on to UE6. The Unreal community is already quite small to begin with, and this would make it very hard to share information or Google for things because the changes between UE5 and UE6 are so drastic that it'll make it hard to find the right answers. The job market for Unreal developers is also going to be a complete mess for a long time because some studios will still have ongoing legacy projects or decide to just stay on UE5 while others move on to UE6. So you'll basically have to master both UE5 and UE6 to have the best chances in the job market. Now, for me personally, things are somewhat bittersweet. I really love blueprints and hate to see them go, even if it's still many years in the future. But at the same time, I also love writing code, and after getting used to Verse, I could imagine using it for future projects once its implementation has been battle tested. Knowing that a lot of people will still stick with UE5 and blueprints has the upside that all of my old tutorials will still be useful to some. But at the same time, I can also make new videos and courses for developers switching over to UE6 or completely new people who are just starting out. And yeah, since I antagonized pretty much every marketing agency out there with my AI rant, and Epic might think twice about working with me again, with me being this critical of their direction, please consider buying my JRPG masterclass from the link in the description. It won't just teach you how to make gorgeous 2.5D JRPGs in Unreal Engine 5, but it's also hands down the best way to master blueprints through building an actual project using best practices. With all of this uncertainty and huge changes coming to the engine, the next couple of years are gonna be pretty rough for all Unreal developers, but we're somehow gonna get through this. As always, a huge thanks to my awesome patrons and YouTube channel members.